You want to put over here or is
No, so when you invite the panelists to Maria?
Maria, she's gonna invite. Oh,
Okay.
John and yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to traffic management here,
Already they staged it, right?
but they will leave the stage this way, and the new people will come up there.
Okay.
Then there's no
Traffic.
traffic issue. Okay. I just let Maria know that. So, Maria, pensez-moi là, quitter la scène. On va les indiquer de partir par là. Donc, on est arrivé par là, comme ça, on a un peu de trafic. Okay, that's good.
Good. Maria. Okay, good. But you don't have to read. Deep motion thing, right? Start? Okay. Maria, we're gonna go. Hey, we're gonna get started, right? Yeah, please.
And will we just speak from our seat? Is that right?
Yes.
Aaron said. Oh, I'm speaking.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to invite everyone to take a seat so we can start on time, please. So welcome everyone back to the final day of Ocean Ops 19. Thank you to everyone who contributed to making this once-a-decade event a success. My name is Maria Snoussi, and I'm professor at the University of Rabat in Morocco, and I'm also a program committee member. Aloha.
I'm Sung-Young Kim from KAIST, Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm participating as a program committee member. Once again, thanks for coming, and all the session leads from yesterday will provide top recommendation. So please you have opportunity to opt in those recommendations. So please log into Slido, then view all the recommendations.
Well, we have a lot of information to get through in less than 1 hour, so let's begin. First, let's bring up John from yesterday's plenary to talk about the integration outcomes. Please, John. Yes.
Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Thank you very much. Jan and I are going to report back from our session yesterday morning on integration. So if we could get the slides up, please. There we go. Thank you. Excuse me. So the first thing I'd like to say is thank you very much to our panelists and our moderator, Katie Hill, for engaging. It was, I thought, a really amazing session yesterday. I learned a lot, and I think it was really, we had a great bunch of panelists, so thank you very much.
Great. So what we're going to do is recap the key messages from the plenary and the panel. Number one, engagement. We need to increase awareness of ocean conditions, marine food security, and other issues, but those ocean conditions and marine food security really came out from the panel. This is critical. Critical to this is involving more users and expanding the diversity of those engaged, and we had diverse voices on our panel yesterday, but there's so many more. We need continuous stakeholder engagement to ensure ocean OBS-based services actually provide that impact. With that engagement, we need timely and tailored information that can provide life-saving alerts, such as we saw the example from Ghana. Collaboration is another key message. Partnering and collaboration are essential to having the ocean observing system that we need, that can deliver the kinds of products that we heard about that will help society. This needs to happen on all scales, local to global, and led by several. We have examples of locally based regional systems. We also have examples of intergovernmental global systems. This needs to apply to all of those. And lastly, co-creation and co-design have to be at the heart of what we do. Co-creation, co-design, that means that it isn't just the scientists coming up with a plan, but that people are working together, that there's connections between users, between governance, and that the co-creation happens together.
Yeah, very much aligned. That means we have to work in an interdisciplinary framework, and this is the set of diagrams from the IMOS Australian system, but I think it applies more generally. Really, we've got to be integrated across space. Things can't be done in silos in spatial terms or in thematic terms. And we've got to link with those people working in the economic spheres and in the societal spheres so that we can really make sure that what we're doing really works for the places where there are real impacts. And then something that was quite new to me and I thought was really interesting is we've got to start thinking in different ways about the way we do our research and work in a more transdisciplinary way. And that doesn't necessarily just mean becoming part of a larger network, but actually new disciplines could be envisaged, such as sustainability science, which you heard about a couple of times. So interdisciplinarity means really opening ourselves up, and that's very important to make our observing networks really work for us and for the people they're meant to work for, of course. And then we heard a fair bit yesterday about governance, and I really like this example from New Zealand, where trying to find spaces and structures which allow different parts of the governance structure to work together effectively was I thought, a really powerful message. And having some success in co-management of the system there through doing that was a really an interesting thing to hear about. We're hearing a lot about other sort of forms of ocean governance, and the structures are changing at the moment. And a lot of those are putting interoperability at their core. And interoperability means more than just interoperability in a technical sense, but in a sense of governance and in a sense of engaging with people. So that maybe the next 10 years is probably going to be quite different in the way we work within our governance structures, and that's probably for the good. I mentioned already this sort of the way of including indigenous societies and traditional knowledge within our official government information. That clearly is key, certainly in a lot of societies and a lot of regions. And the inclusion of that knowledge includes inclusion of best practices, which we really need to work on. And then finally, around governance, there's the data management governance. Really, the infrastructure for data management needs investment. We heard about the statement that if you invest 10% of every project on data management, you avoid the risk of losing 90% of your value from the observations. And I think that's a really nice take-home message. We really need to make sure that we go that extra 10% to make the best use of what we're doing. And we need to carefully design the underlying metadata within our observations to make our observations usable for everyone. And the collect once, use often motto is a really useful one. If you don't do that investment in underlying metadata, underlying information about the observations, you will struggle to make your observation usable for the broad range of users we really need to get across to. So really important points. I thought it was a great session. So thank you very much, and I hope people found it as interesting as I did. Mahalo.
Now we have 8 breakout session recommendations. The first one will be Arctic Observing by Molly McCammon, Alaska Ocean Observing System.
Thank you very much. I want to also thank my co-lead, Sandy Starkweather from the U.S. Arctic Observing Network, who helped put this session together. We had about 90 to 100 people attend. These were mostly from the research community. Unfortunately, we had no Indigenous people attending. We had a competing session, unfortunately. And also, we had an Arctic Futures 2050 conference in Washington, D.C. about 2 weeks prior. And so we had over 70 Indigenous attendees at that. We did not focus our discussion on the challenges of operating observing systems in the Arctic. There are many. They're well documented. Sea ice, remoteness, darkness, lack of power, communications, kind of a diffuse distributed leadership, data sharing issues, on and on and on. It is a challenging place to work. But rather, we focused on 2 questions. How do we set priorities for making strategic investments that are requirements-based and that clearly have value and benefits to stakeholders? And how can we strengthen existing or planned organizations and governmental entities to provide the leadership in the Arctic and take advantage of things like the Arctic Council, the Arctic Observing Summit, GEO, GOOSE, the WMO, the UN Decade of the Ocean? So how can we work with those? We used 4 presentations to describe current planning efforts at regional to pan-Arctic scales and included 3 other experts at the front table to provide some extra expertise, including a representative from the Southern Ocean so we could get lessons learned from Antarctic region. We had a lively discussion for more than an hour. Our team had drafted 5 potential recommendations, and these were ranked by the audience. The audience also ranked the relative importance of potential societal benefit areas to help guide priorities. And not surprisingly, given the audience makeup of largely scientists, the priorities were heavily scientific. So weather and climate prediction, fundamental understanding of Arctic systems and processes, and marine and coastal ecosystems and processes. So a heavily science-driven agenda there. But we did come up with the 3 top recommendations that you see on the screen here. By Ocean OBS 2029, the Arctic should be able to prominently demonstrate it has a fully developed, implemented, and sustained ocean observing system that meets, at a minimum, Earth system prediction needs, but also meets other critical societal benefit areas. So we were really gratified to see the support in the audience and really at this entire conference for the Arctic and for the critical role the Arctic plays in the carbon cycle, in the energy cycle, in the atmospheric weather cycle. And so we really look towards this global support to help fill what is now currently a huge gap. The second recommendation is that the Arctic community should seriously consider developing a node or regional alliance under the umbrella of a global framework such as GOOSE. The idea here is that this could really help generate global interest and potential funding. We already have a structure, the Arctic Council, and a sustained Arctic Observing Network. The network is definitely under-resourced. We need to get more attention, more funding. We need to get a better message across about the critical role that the Arctic plays in everything that's happening around the globe. So a key recommendation there. The third recommendation was that Arctic observing and planning should draw extensively on the principles of co-production, co-design, and co-management of observing systems with inclusion of indigenous and local communities. This is definitely a theme that we have heard throughout this conference, and it's really gratifying to see it highlighted so well, and I really thank Jan Newton and others on the planning team for doing this. These groups are definitely the ones who are most impacted by what is an increasingly rapid change in the Arctic. So it's important that they be involved at the outset. A close fourth recommendation that we talked about but didn't hit the top three was making sure that the Arctic observing systems were aligned with new and emerging thematic global networks, such as the ocean acidification network, harmful algal bloom networks, biology and biodiversity, omics, things like this, so that we're not operating in a vacuum and we can take advantage of lessons learned and technology and modeling advances. So again, I want to thank all of the participants in that session and those who helped put it together. Thank you.
The next report will be given by Jessica Hausman from NASA about data integration with users' products. Please, Jessica.
So our session was data integration with user products. The basic theme is that to help enable data products for a multitude of different varieties of users, data need to follow the FAIR principles. They need to have long-term management and stewardship that then enables them to be, so then you can write open software and APIs on top of the original data. So now you can bring multiple disparate data into one system and then be able to build interfaces. So now you can have a larger community who are not experts on those original data formats, or not necessarily even experts with coding, to now have that available to them. So you can have people who are planning for sea level rise, fisheries management, or even scientists who need to use data from satellites, instruments, moorings, models, be able to have it all come to one place without needing to know every single component. So our 3 recommendations were that funding agencies of ocean observing systems need to align funding to meet the demands of data management, long-term stewardship, and training by participating in multiple organizations that have already well-known informatics backgrounds, and also help provide best practices and recommendations on a lot of the topics that have already been spoken here, which is FAIR, data quality, how do you do open source software, and help enable science. So data management, of course, includes data stewardship. It includes using the FAIR principles. For long-term stewardship, there is a concern with funding where a lot of PIs have funding for so many years for the proposal ends. They no longer have funding to maintain a data product they might have produced. So what happens to that? Also, what happens when you need to put your data in a data repository? How do you find these repositories? Because it is a requirement at most of the science journals that you need to have your data in a repository now. Our second is to qualify user products. Quantified measurement uncertainty should be added to each measurement result entered into ocean observing systems. What this means is you should have some way of measuring what the quality or the uncertainty of the measurement is. So now you can understand where the errors are coming from further down the road, and then that information can be kept when you do transformations of the data to make other value-added products. Data providers should strive to use web services with well-described and open APIs to distribute and make their data accessible to human and machine-readable consumers to enable data products downstream. I think one of the things that was discussed, that visualizations are very, very powerful for these user products. You might not know that you necessarily need this particular data, but seeing it helps enable that you can recognize it very quickly. You don't need a lot of expertise to go to a web browser and click through a time series and see what the data look like for that amount of time, or even the parameters. And you can also, a lot of these visualization tools that are available now, you can even overlay data. So you can see like, oh, I have multiple data sets available to me that can tell me various aspects. Like if you're studying hurricanes, you can do sea surface temperature, winds, temperature anomalies, height anomalies, gather all that information, grab that data just for that piece, and now you can even see what the chlorophyll would be also from the upwelling due to the hurricane. So now you can have all those pieces, figure out exactly like, oh, this these are the pieces that I need for my research, or these are the pieces I might need for an impact study down the road, without having to go to multiple data centers, multiple repositories, and have that done for you by your subject-specific communities.
Thank you. Next recommendation is about governance needs, which will be given by Tosted Tana, Guillermo Institute of Center for Ocean Research, Kiel.
Oh, thank you. So we had a very interesting and I think very productive breakout session, and thanks to a very good panel by, so in the panel was John Gunn and Jessica Snowden, Indy Hodgson-Johnson, Wendy Watson-Wright, Bob Weller, Fan Wang, and Craig McLean. So the ocean observing governance has changed a lot since Ocean Ops 09. The ocean observation community has been is much broader. The community is broader. We have many more partners, many more stakeholders. We have expanded set of requirements. We're using more EUVs. We have a big, much higher user pool. It means that we have a much more complex system, which means that the governance system that we devised back in 2009 is not quite fit for purpose, and that is the background of this whole session. So recently, Goose has developed a strategy that looks at connecting a much bigger community to a bigger vision for ocean observing. So to realize this strategy, we will need a step change in the level of partner engagement, but also change the governance to adhere to all these 11 strategic objectives that are listed on this slide. So looking at governance of complex organizations at multi-levels, it's kind of, there are a couple of frameworks that are useful to look at. So one of them is what we call multi-level polycentric, or another very closely related one is collective impact organization. So you can see how different organizations work in parallel at different levels, geographic levels. And to the right, you can see how we have a government's modality spectrum moving from the left in a very authoritative governance structure, or to the right, a fully polycentric structure. And the current system is somewhere in the middle, so we have to take the decision, should we move left or should we move right on this spectrum? So there are advantages and disadvantages of both ways. It was raised in the panel that there are some advantages of a more regulatory framework, speak WMO and metrology, where there are some regulations pushed down to the member nations. So we did a poll, and these are the major recommendations that came out of the session. So we recognize the ocean observing governance in multi-level with many centers of activity, so it's polycentric. So the first step of realizing that is important. So we need to engage all of them to analyze gaps, harmonize principles, improve learning and sharing and conflict resolution, and develop the networks of actors. And the second most popular suggestion, and they were very close actually, and they are very closely linked to each other, that we want to have a collective impact with our stakeholders. So let's build a common agenda, ways to measure it, measure how we reinforce or enforce the agenda, not actually the measurements of ocean. Mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication and backbone support, which is the collective impact model. And we also suggest to commission a working group, including ocean observers and governance experts, to develop the RISE governance system based on ideas presented here at Ocean Ops 19. And one way to augment that activity is a working group or a project that has coming into the second phase from Bob Weller, funded by National Academy of Science. And the first phase of that project was the base, I think, from the community white paper of Bob Weller that outlines ideas for a common impact strategy. I think that was the main recommendation of our working group, to take this forward. Thank you.
Next report will be given by Erin Satterthwaite, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, about Integrated Ocean Observation 3. Erin is from NCA's and Future Earth. Please go.
Great, thank you so much. So, my name is Erin Satterthwaite, and I'm speaking on behalf of the session leads for the Integrated Ocean Observations 3 across disciplines and networks. And so integration has clearly been an emerging theme throughout this conference, and definitely in line with that, the goal of our breakout session was to refine recommendations required to strengthen a globally coordinated and sustained ocean observing system focused on biodiversity and ecosystems. So before I report out, I wanted to fully acknowledge with a shout out the session organizers, Patricia and Nick, our synthesizer, Samantha, the co-organizers listed here, the expert panel that really provided valuable insight throughout the session, and the representatives from these organizations that supported throughout the entire process of developing this session. And most of the preliminary work was supported by NCEAS and Future Earth, the people that fund my postdoc position. And so there were 3 main recommendations that we started our discussion with. The first, and actually to make a quick note, on the left you'll see the percentages. These are the percentages of the respondents that thought that these recommendations were particularly important. And so the first is to increase regional and global coordination throughout the next decade, focusing on partnerships and improved communication, observational capacity, including improved data sharing, an expanded funding base for sustained observations. And then the second is to report progress towards the desired global ocean observing system through biennial reporting to the United Nations using the essential ocean variables as a reporting framework. And then the third is to ensure that the observing networks contributing to the global ocean observing system provide updated metadata on their progress towards full maturity under the FOO, as well as their data to the relevant open and fair regional and global databases. And I'll speak to the full maturity a bit later, but I then wanted to go into some of the points that came out of our lively and very fun discussion in our working group. So some of the specific themes and ideas that emerged from our discussion were, one, the theme of collaboration. And so one of the points was that we're working in a complex ecosystem and landscape of organizations, and within each of our networks, we need to identify key individuals and determine how we can work in the most complementary way together. The second is a community of practice. So we need champions and a community of practice, which are essential to build our networks. The third is multidisciplinary. We need to connect with other disciplines like the social sciences to develop a strategy on how to move implementation forward. And then participation. Citizen science was discussed as a tool to build capacity and improve communication. There was sharing. We need spaces to share lessons, just like here at Ocean Obs in these sessions, learn between existing and emerging networks. And then to connect, so publicize what we are doing and make sure that we chat across our networks. And then demonstrate, we need to have data products to show early successes. Value, as a community, we need to look at the value of why we're doing this and articulate it clearly. And then involvement, we need to figure out how to find and reach networks that are measuring our essential ocean variables and other things, but may not be involved in our community and process. And so I'd like to bring up the last slide. So, and then just to conclude, we discussed these attributes of what we thought. This comes from the Observations Coordination Group and has been adapted in the BioEco Goose panel discussions and in the Pegasus working groups. And so we wanted to put these up at the end to basically, we think that they apply to many networks, whether they're for biology or ecosystems, physical or biogeochemical, or a potentially emerging social science network. And so I wanted to leave you with this, and thank you very much for listening.
Next recommendation is about ocean best practices by Jeff Pullman, Institute of Electronical and Electronics Engineers.
Thank you very much. Best practices have been mentioned a number of places. In fact, the panel to my left had mentioned it consistently. And so we're understanding what the needs are and perhaps even where the use is and the benefits. But the challenge to really making it happen is to understand how to implement the support and the systems necessary to make best practices accessible, adoptable, and used. In this breakout session, we emphasize the processes that are needed to make best practices practical. And I want to, on the screen, acknowledge all of the people, the moderators, the panel, and the organizers that have worked with us to make what was a very exciting session. Best practices span the value chain from traditional areas that you know of, such as observing or analysis, but they move well beyond that. They talked yesterday about best practices for collaboration and other areas that we need to think and we need to expand our minds and how to deal with it. So in the session that we had to address certain selected focus areas because it'd be impossible to address everything. And we chose systems, sensors, platforms, data capability, data capacity, and capacity building, and more than that finally as we expanded the discussion. The things that we took from those discussions were questions of how do best practices evolve to standards? How do we address standards? And in our work, the need for standards as we begin to globalize becomes more and more important. We need to link data to practices and publications to practices so that there's an integrated access. And finally, we need to work with the community to further the adoption of best practices. Now, in addition to talking about some of these items, we also identified certain practices that we felt were important. Consider FAIR principles. How do we have them for data, metadata, and in fact, more broadly, and make sure that the data is free if possible. Data management costs should be included in proposals and in projects, and capacity development, the same thing. So from that, we ended up with 3 priority recommendations, and you see them on the screen. The Ocean Best Practice System as a sustainable system for best practices is important and needs to be moved forward. Establish community-based review capabilities for best practices, and there's a need for convergence of best practices. When you have multiple practices in the same subject, many people ask, how do we know which one to pick? And then, as usual, if you have 3, you always want a 4th. And so if there was a 4th, the ocean and applications community should be supported in creating and applying best practices. There need to be some advocacy and help. So those were the recommendations we have, and we certainly bring them to you, and we're looking for responses. But those recommendations are maybe a few years, and we really need a long-term vision to move the process forward. And so we wanted to bring to the conference the long-term vision and best practices, and that's to have agreed and broadly adopted methods across ocean research, operations, and applications. That's our goal. You have to have a way to make that goal, the process to get there. And so we define a mission, and that's to provide coordinated and sustained global access to methodologies, and that's best practices, of course, also across ocean science to foster collaboration and innovation. And I should comment that in our session, the microphones were overused. And so in the end, we not only couldn't service everybody, but we barely got to the questions that were being asked on Slido. And so we promised the community in our newsletter, Good, Better, Best, that comes out monthly, we would answer your questions. Thank you.
Next presentation is about traditional knowledge building, and it will be given by Jorn Schmidt from Kiel Marine Science at Kiel University.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And as you can see on the slide, I actually changed the title to Traditional Knowledge Integration because we were of the opinion that we don't need to build traditional knowledge that comes on itself. We had a very, very full and rich session and a discussion, and thank you very much to Shelley Denny and Michael Vey that served on the panel and presented, and there was lively interaction in the room, and it was an amazing and active audience, and I think it was also a good mixture of representatives of different indigenous communities as well as scientists from different disciplines. And it's all about different knowledge systems and how to bring different knowledge systems together. And I think there needs to be the realization that when we talk about societal needs, you need to go to the people. And societal needs means you need to go to society, but it also means that you need to go to the communities that are living not only at the ocean, but with the ocean. And I think this is something that is very central. And all these, the societies as well as the communities are building up knowledge. And very often when we talk about that knowledge, we talk about space-based local knowledge, that it's about, you know, where a fish spawns or how things are changing. But there needs to be a realization that there's very many different dimensions to knowledge and also to observing. And there needs to be the recognition of the fact that when we talk about indigenous and traditional knowledge, then there's much more than just information. It's the way of living, it's the way of values, the beliefs that are connected to that. So it is much richer, and we need to recognize that, and we need to understand that when we engage with these communities. So having said that, I think I need to click on this one. I would say, coming from Jay, we just put 4 on. We just took the offer of actually take a 4th one on. And so we came up with 4 recommendations. Actually, we had more, and they can be refined. And I think we can also, you know, discuss how they can be refined. And so the first one was, and that was a recognition that I think it is very important to build up capacity within the scientific community to understand and value indigenous and other knowledge systems. I think that's very important, that people are engaging and understanding what the value of these different knowledge systems is, and also to understand how to engage and how to interact and how to bring the different people together. As I said, there are different dimensions to that. So there's also, you see that I talk sometimes about indigenous and sometimes about communities. There are differences if you look globally. So we had a very strong representation of different indigenous communities across the Pacific. And we have also recognized that there is actually a lot of communities and societies that we have not quite well integrated in the conference yet. So there was a mentioning of a lack of representation of African countries. And I think this is something that the community really needs to look into and engage and reach out also to these communities. And what really is important, and I think we have seen a couple of very good examples of how a community-supported observation could look like. So coming back to observations here. And it's important to connect these initiatives and exchange success stories and challenges to develop a framework for community-supported observation and to give community-supported observations voices in the global ocean observing community. How to connect the initiatives that are actually there because they're serving a very local and a very specific purpose most of the time. How can we link that into the broader community? And then partnering with communities to develop mutual beneficial interdisciplinary projects with social sciences and indigenous knowledge systems, recognizing that we need to work on the same level. So we are coming from two different sides maybe, but we need to communicate on an eye level. And then also, and this is really, really important, to ensure long-term funding for community-based projects to accommodate for the needs for increased interaction. So we always ask for money, and that's specifically true here, so we always ask for money, but I think there needs to be the recognition that if you want to engage with these with any community, independently on where that is, you need to have time, you need to build up trust, you need to have time to work with the people. So there needs to be also a long-term funding, and not like a 3-year project where the scientists are coming into an area, and after 3 years they are going away, and then they're going into different areas. So there needs to be long-term commitment for these activities. And these are the 4 recommendations that came out of the session, and I thank you very much for your attention. I hope that we can bring this forward. Thank you.
So far, we have 6 sessions recommendations. We have 2 more to go. Next one will be Uncertainty Quantification by Shane Ellipod at University of Miami.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here on the last day. So along with my colleagues, Carla Drushka from the University of Washington and Anish Subramanian from the University of Colorado Boulder, we organized this breakout session on uncertainty quantification. So just a little bit of background. Our engagement into this topic actually stems from our current engagement with US CLIVAR, which is a US research program with a mission to foster understanding and prediction of climate variability. And specifically, the 3 of us are members currently of the Phenomena Observations and Synthesis panel, whose mission is to improve understanding of the climate variations and to develop synthesis of critical climate parameters while sustaining and improving the global climate observing system. Ambitious. That being said, the panel has identified the topic of uncertainty quantification to be of critical importance, especially as we move forward into the next decade of ocean and climate observations. As such, we're very grateful to the Ocean Ops 19 Organization Committee to recognize the need to have a breakout session on this topic. And we do recognize that this topic also converges with other topics that were covered, as an example, by the breakout session on best practices. So the take-home message is basically, without an estimate of its uncertainty, an ocean observation is much less powerful. Another way to say this is that an ocean observation with an uncertainty is a better observation. So as you can see on this panel, on this slide, the objective of the session was to determine recommendations for quantifying, characterizing, and communicating and making use of uncertainty information in ocean observations. As a first activity during the breakout session, we asked the audience to answer the question, what does uncertainty mean to you? And the results are summarized in the word cloud on the slide on the screen, and from which you can draw easily some conclusions already. So we would like to acknowledge and thank our panelists for this session. We had 4 short presentations by Mark Bushnell, Shell Genteman, Roberto Sabia, and Patrick Einbach. Thank you very much for your presentation. We did try to cover in situ data, remote sensing data, as well as the use of ocean observing data in models. We do recognize that we were heavily biased towards physical observations of the ocean and not so much about biological or geochemical, and so we could have done better, but it is acknowledged. So we started with 3 draft recommendations, which we modified according to the questions and comments from the audience. We had a lot of suggestions, and the audience was very opinionated, which was great. So in no specific order, we came up with 3 concrete, actionable recommendations. So the first one is that we should train ocean observers and modelers in statistical terminology and techniques for the purpose of uncertainty quantifications. So here we're not talking about best practices for measurements because such efforts already exist. We are specifically talking about improving our understanding of statistical techniques and terminology. Actually, the lack of knowledge and understanding of statistics, we believe, is a major reason for which we do not have good quantification of uncertainties in ocean observing. So example of implementation of that recommendation could be the use of workshops, improve graduate programs, use new online tools, etc., etc. At your next conference on ocean observing, why don't you have half a day of training for graduate students on statistics and uncertainty quantification as an example. So we use the term ocean observers in this recommendation broadly to mean anyone making or using ocean measurements or derived products. We suggest a training both for the current and future generations of ocean observers. A lot of material exists already for this training, but new tools based on new technology could definitely be derived. Our second recommendation is to build on existing efforts. We should produce a series of peer-reviewed and open access documents that define and recommend strategies and best practices for uncertainty quantification in ocean observers. So this document should cover things such as vocabulary, techniques, new frameworks for activities such as citizen science, and explain the importance of metadata for uncertainty quantification. And finally, we think that research programs should require and fund routine uncertainty estimates on ocean observations and derived products, and should fund dedicated efforts to develop freely available resources, such as software and database for uncertainty quantification. And so this requires perhaps a culture change, and that may not occur overnight, and this change may be phased in over the next decade. Implementation of this recommendation requires increasing statistical literacy of the ocean observing communities. Thank you.
The last, but certainly not the least, report of this breakout session will be given by Emily Smail from Geo and Blue Planet about the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. So our session, we had a discussion about how the ocean observing community could and should contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who are not familiar with those goals, they are a group of 17 goals that were agreed upon by the United Nations member countries that include goals such as zero hunger, no poverty, climate action, life on land, and life below water, which is aimed at the oceans. One of the things that we talked about related to the goals themselves is that they're very interlinked and that the ocean plays a role across all of the goals and not just on life below water, which is SDG 14. In our recommendations, we discussed that one of the priorities that we need to work on is getting early career professionals as well as students in the ocean observing community engaged in the SDG so that there is a long-term international momentum and that we can get an integrated way that we have society engaged in trying to reach these goals towards 2030, which is when the targets for many of them are. Our second recommendation was that we need to increase the capacity of developing countries to have information related to the Sustainable Development Goals. So some of the discussion that we had is that some of the smaller countries will have one person that may be responsible for reporting and collecting information on 200 goals. And that obviously is very overwhelming, and if the international community does not provide support to them, what's likely going to happen is that there will not be information reported on those goals. We also need to work together as a community to try to make that easier for developing countries for the goals that are related to ocean observing. And there are several efforts to do that, and we discussed two of them in our session. One is ocean acidification, and another one is coastal eutrophication and floating plastics. And those are both being developed with expert input from the ocean observing community. And that leads into our third recommendation, which was to enhance the connections between our scientists and the statistical agencies who are reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we had a lot of discussion about how some of the researchers and applied oceanographers and ocean observers are interested in contributing to the Sustainable Development Goal development of the methods. So these are methods that are put together by what are called custodian agencies, which are different UN groups such as IOC, UNESCO, and UN Environment that are responsible for putting forward information related to how the data should be collected for the SDGs. And for that, they've been putting together various expert groups to consult with the ocean observing community. And we had some questions about how people could get engaged in that. So one of the actions we're taking for that is to put together summarized information about who your contacts are for different SDG indicators, or how you find your local statistical offices or contact points for various indicators. So that's something that we will be working with to pass along to the SDGs. As well as we had a discussion related to the scientific community and ocean observing related to wanting to put forward information related to the targets and indicators that were selected. So within each goal, there are targets, and then underneath those, there are several indicators that were negotiated at a political level. And many of the scientists were, not in the room and part of that discussion. And so there is some frustration that maybe these should be different. So one of the challenges with that is that it's a fairly difficult and bureaucratic process to actually change the goals. And while we can put forward recommendations for new goals, we didn't want to overwhelm the international community with more data collection, since a lot of the countries are already saying they're really overwhelmed already. But one thing we can do is to work with the custodian agencies to try to suggest sub-indicators that would help countries get the information they need to actually make the decisions that would allow them to meet those goals. And we'd like to thank all of our panelists and speakers. It was a really great discussion.
Now, I would like to ask the breakout chairs to leave the stage, please. And please, just a moment. And take their seat so we can make a room for the next activity. But before leaving, let's give an applause for them, for all of them. Thank you.
So Maria and myself, we're gonna recap the special sessions while the special event will prepare on the stage. Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna go right. So special session, the building on international transparent ocean community. There are 4 items. Transparent Ocean Initiative will greatly contribute to the ocean decade of ocean sciences for sustainable development by providing vital information relevant to the development goals. It is essential to integrate observations, process studies, and prediction projection so as to meet the multiple demands of the end users. Strengthen efforts is needed to meet challenges of effective communication between science and research community and the general public. The Transparent Ocean Initiative could be an appropriate platform for overcoming difficulties in data sharing, particularly coastal ocean data. And second special session is about fostering an ocean literate generation. There are 3 recommendations. Promotion of ocean literacy in order to engage people on the pathway to a sustainable interaction with the ocean. Need to be encouraged ocean science outreach and communication activities and funding opportunity relevant to formal and informal educational environments in order to increase ocean literacy. implementation of the marine-friendly curricula in terms of school courses and textbook, as well as the teacher trainings, can be at all levels, primary and tertiary, in all countries, in understanding-based manner. Third one, Ocean Partnership for Sustained Observing. There are 3 recommendations. Identify willing champions and experts to facilitate a network of advisors and collective impact organizations that help with trans-sector partnership development and maintenance at national to regional to global scales. Design and implement an international organizational structure for the development and resourcing of global partnership around the capacity building and maintenance in the ocean observations and larger ocean science. Create a framework for partnership building that provides guidance for research institutions, countries, philanthropies, etc., that wish to establish programs around ocean observations, products, and or services.
Yeah, for the observing needs in the deep ocean, there were 3 recommendations. The first one is to extend deep ocean observing capacities to the global scales as part of the UN decade, addressing all deep ocean relevant EOVs and building on existing assets and networks. The second recommendation is to improve standardization of and access to deep ocean observing data, samples, and derived products. And the last one is to facilitate partnerships, collaboration, integration, and capacity building across deep ocean observing communities, including deep ocean exploration, seafloor mapping, and private sectors through the deep ocean observing strategy. Well, now for the final special session report, I'd like to invite Ken Paul from the Canadian Indigenous Delegation to present the report from the Indigenous Town Hall. Please, Ken Paul.
I don't know, cell phone is just, yeah, okay. Nali was Zagli Gatpuid Muinaga Nujiao Wolastuki Ngutkuk. I want to acknowledge the space that Ocean Obs has made for the Indigenous delegations that are here at this event. It's really been a very important meeting for us. I feel like we've been welcomed, that we are having people that are really starting to understand our messaging here. And one of the things that we wanted to do here in front of the delegation for you as witnesses is make a presentation so that you can recognize that how important we feel it is to be a part of this community. What we have here, who I have here beside me is Kitty Simons, who's the Executive Director of the Western Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Council, and Vladimir Ryabinin, who's the Executive Secretary for the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. And what we did this week, we worked on a declaration, which I would like to read out loud to you. And Kitty is going to present it to Vladimir. So we're doing this to support Indigenous nations. And we just want to a representative of the United Nations, IOC, and we just wanted you guys to witness this for us. So I'm going to read through the declaration here now. Aha Honua, Coastal Indigenous Peoples Declaration at Ocean Obs 19. We, the Indigenous delegates at Ocean Obs 19, present this declaration known as Aha Honua to our fellow members of the global ocean observing community. Indigenous peoples continue to perpetuate our cultures and governance systems, as we've done for generations. Our ancestral, cultural, and spiritual connections to natural resources, maintain our inherent governance systems, as well as to establish the foundation for our principles of sustainability. Our existence comes from all life, and therefore we, as first stewards, have a responsibility to our oceans and shoreline ecosystems. We call on the ocean observing community to formally recognize the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples worldwide, as well as the articles under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We will work with the ocean observing community to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. We call on the ocean observing community to establish meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities, organizations, and nations to learn and respect each other's ways of knowing, negotiate paths forward to design, develop, and carry out ocean observing initiatives, and share responsibility and resources. It's delivered this 20th day of September in the year 2019 by the Indigenous delegates of Ocean Obs 19 in Honolulu, Hawaii. We have actual hard paper copies available for those that would like a copy of this, and we're going to be trying to, we've been working with the organizers to maybe have it available through the app as well, so that you can access this that way. So with that, I would like to call on our two presenters.
So, Vladimir, mahalo nui loa for receiving the Ahahonua Declaration. We, the Indigenous delegates, stand ready to work with you to advancing the recognition of our traditional knowledge and to establishing meaningful partnerships with the ocean observing community.
Thank you very much. I would like also to thank Ocean Ops for offering this opportunity to receive and return the respect to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So what this brings to us, what are the ingredients of this? This is respect to life, to elders, to Mother Nature, attachment to your homeland, respect to traditions, following traditions, and also ethical approach. Indigenous knowledge and culture bring to us multi-century wisdom, and this they bring to our young science. So the goals of this is to live in harmony with soul and nature, and this is our ultimate goal. So I promise on behalf of the observing community, on behalf of IOC, of UNESCO, and also on behalf of people who will be involved in the decade of ocean science, that we will respect this declaration, we will study this and use. So indigenous courtesy rituals often includes exchange of gifts. This is a very important gift for us. What I would like to do in return, and this topic was mentioned in the declaration, is to give you a pin that I have on me. So this is a pin. It will be difficult to see, but you know it has Sustainable Development Rainbow, the logo of IOC, and the number 14, the goal on the ocean. So I hope it will guide you and all of us in our future work. Thank you very much.
Ue kalani na ue ka honua, ne e ka honua, o la I ka honua, ho o la ka honua. Ku o ka wailuo ke ku puna, ku paa ke ka naka Māori, ki he Māori o la.
Okay, once again, let's give a big hand, round of applause to all the special events. Now we're going to move on to the fresh perspective towards the Ocean Up 29. Sanai, please come on stage. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to ask all the panelists coming up to the stage now. Maybe we should start. Okay, we should start. Okay, daily theme of the last day of the conference is vision. That is a vision for the future ocean observing. But also this is a ceremony for passing torch to the Ocean of 29 and also to the new generations. This panel, the fresh perspective toward Ocean of 29, is organized by the early career participants. They are the generation who must have the interdisciplinary perspective from the start of their careers. And also they are the generation who use the gadget like a Slido just naturally. And they will be the main player of the decade of the ocean science and will be the leaders of Oceans of 29 and more. The early career community has had a series of meetings during this conference. And they have discussed about their visions and perspectives in the next decade. So these 8 ladies and gentlemen are here to represent the voice of their community. We are keen to see what their fresh eye can see, and we are really keen to see what kind of really inspirational, innovative, and creative idea which may bring the solution to the problem we have now. Okay, so the moderator is Ruth Perry. She's working at the Shell, Texas. She's a marine scientist and a regulatory policy specialist responsible for offshore marine environmental policy for Shell exploration and production Americas teams. And next to Ruth is Karina Kazmionova. Sorry about the pronunciation. Oh, no, it's Karina. Yep. And she's the Associate Program Officer for the Gulf Research Program. And she has worked hard to organize the early career events and made this panel happen. So I will pass the microphone to Ruth to take over.
Thank you, Sunny. So you know that you've officially stepped out of Young Career when they ask you to moderate the Young Career, so I think that means that I'm now a mid-career scientist. This panel, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit more about Karina, because if you don't know, while you've been here sitting in these sessions, the Young Careers have been in the background really working, all the way from their entire day Sunday to this panel, and they're going to be the ones working beyond. And so Karina has been kind of spearheading this, and for the National Academies of Science in terms of running that workshop where they had over 100 Young Careers participate on Sunday, to organizing lunches and breakfast meetings so that we could get together, or I'm no longer in this group, so that they could get together and really think about how they can play a much stronger role in Ocean Ops 29 and how they can get more integrated into the process. And so I wanted to start out actually giving a big hand for Karina, because she's been behind the scenes and not up front, but she certainly deserves a round of applause and appreciation from the audience in terms of all the hard work she's put in. Okay, so I want you to pull out your phones as we get the slides back up. This group actually up front wanted to ask you a question to start off our panel. And so if I can get the Slido question up, it's a word cloud, 1 to 2 answers. So really, as an ocean observer, in your kind of scientific capacity, your work capacity, what do you care about? And I know some of you might have had fun at the luau, but, there we go. Good, thank you. So while this is going, we're going to give you a couple seconds. I didn't want to sit and introduce the panelists. I wanted to get them warmed up by giving them a quick opportunity lightning round to tell you who they are, where they are from, and what they're doing. So we'll go ahead and start that down the row while the audience is filling in their doodle poll. Or Slido poll, excuse me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Kirsten Forsberg. I'm from Peru. I'm a biologist, but I also consider myself as a social entrepreneur. I founded a nonprofit called Planeta Oceano in Peru that works to engage coastal communities and marine conservation through research, through ocean literacy and education, and through sustainable development. I founded this organization as an undergraduate student when I was 22 years old. That was around 12 years ago. And so I'm a real firm believer in the power of youth to lead change from a very, very early age.
Yawawaktus, Kanistisla Klunukwa, Heishlak Nugwa, Sukusnukwas Gyach Gaios. Hello to all my relatives. My name is Kanistisla, and I'm from the Heiltsuk First Nation on the coast of British Columbia, from a town of 1,200 people called Bella Bella. And I have been very fortunate to work directly with my community as well as my neighboring nations of the Kitasoo, Nuhulk, and Wikino nations at the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, which is an organization dedicated to helping build the technical capacity for stewardship on the Central Coast when it comes to negotiations with the provincial government, federal government, but also stakeholders who wish to come and do work in their territories as well. And so we have our mandate set by those nations, we work for those nations, and we hope to advance Indigenous-led stewardship on the Central Coast of British Columbia.
Aloha, good morning everyone. My name is Sheikh Hussein. I come from Sierra Leone. I'm an oceanographer and fisheries expert. My early career after graduating from university, I was teaching at the university. I taught at the University of Liberia, and I was head of the physical department there, and also at Froabe College in the Institute of Marine Biology. I'm currently the Director of Operations for a Consortium of Natural Resource Management in Sierra Leone, and I also have a background of over 10 years working in the Fisheries Department in the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources. And before coming here a few months ago, I've been awarded a scholarship to undertake a PhD research at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Tasmania, in Australia.
您好, aloha. I'm Samuel Wang, a research scientist and program management from Xiamen University and the Second Institute of Oceanography in China. This is my first Ocean Ops. I'm very delighted to be here with many of our old friends. Also, it's my great honor to be here to be one of the panelists. I see myself as a social scientist who trying to use a very little science brain to bridge the science and policy gap in the field of coastal management and urban climate change adaptation. I was working with Jen Newton, Fei Chai-Ming Han Dai to co-organize the fourth Go On workshop, which took place in China this April. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Since I got introduced already, I'll say thank you to the program committee to include the early career in the program. When I got involved in organizing the early career events, I look back at Ocean Ops 99 and 09 to look what have been done there, and there was not much for the early career. And I think there's still a lot more we can do, but I want to say thank you, and I want to say thank you for participation and for everybody who showed up on Sunday and throughout the week to the lunches and the early career room. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to echo what Karina just said. It's been really a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunities that people have helped to make happen for us. So I'm Erin Satterthwaite, and I'm at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and also part of Future Earth, currently in Santa Barbara, California. And I'm a postdoc working on supporting with developing a prototype for the biological global ocean observing system. And also I'm working with the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And through these, I really am dedicated to connecting diverse forms of knowledge to create wisdom to then spur action. Thank you.
Mabuhay and aloha mai kako. I am Clarice Sullivan. I am a master's student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm also a researcher at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, and it's an honor to actually be selected to be one of the panelists as one of their youngest ones. I am here to learn more from you, and I'm happy to be part of the process and to share my early career thoughts with you all. Thank you.
Maybe mine's off. There we go. So you can see the wide diversity up here. And this group really wanted to try to make this an interactive panel, so we appreciate that you're putting your answers in. And we wanted to show you over the week what these folks on stage, but also the entire group of young careers, they did the same exercise. So if we could go to the next slide and show what they think when they are asked the questions. I want to point out that you can probably see there's a lot of differences. And so we wanted to use this to kind of frame up the panel to really open your minds to what these men and women on the stage are going to tell you. And we're going to go into a couple questions that I asked them, and then we're going to take some of the Slido questions to give you an opportunity to react to some of the things you heard. Because as you can see, this is a phenomenal group of men and women. And I've had the special privilege to work with them this week, and they have the special honor to present to you, but also they're the ones that are going to take the helm over the next 10, 20, 30 plus years. So let's get into it. The first question that I asked this group to address is to tell me what they care about. And so we're going to go through this. So who answered this, or who provided this one? Can you tell us a little bit why?
I think we've heard indigenous knowledge being important to ocean observing and science a lot this week. But for me, it's not providing just an opportunity for science to include indigenous knowledge, but to give indigenous knowledge its own space. And so that's why I said indigenous knowledge and science. I've seen a lot of integration with indigenous knowledge this week, but I think it's really important to make sure that the pre-existing models and frameworks aren't just wedging in indigenous science, indigenous knowledge, but also providing an entirely new avenue for indigenous knowledge to be an equal foot on the ground and an equal voice at the table.
Great, thank you. Sustainable systems, who contributed this one?
I was really happy to see that, that sustainability was coming out in the word cloud. So I value sustainable systems, and by that I mean systems that are resilient and persist as things change. And to me, a key feature of these systems is that they're diverse. So I think for me, I really value connecting with new people, especially those that have different ways of thinking. I think human systems require diverse modes of thought, and providing and promoting spaces for those diverse thoughts to come together and to work through and share ideas. Thanks.
Great. Next, social science.
Well, as I see myself as social science, I care about solution. So the theme of this Ocean Ops is about solutions. So from my perspective, social sciences should be part of an integral part. Should be an integral part of the solution, as I think social scientists can connect the ordinary citizens to the ocean, and they can also identify the stakeholders, identify the needs of better identify the users' needs, and also aid better communication between the natural scientists and policymakers. Social scientists can also provide a more holistic picture with the perspective of institutional to drive the future ocean observing plans. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Climate change.
What inspired me to think about climate change adaptation is the inequality with regards to the climate change effect itself. For example, some countries emit very little greenhouse gases, but they suffer the most from climate change impact. Other countries emit most. So one of the key issues we experience in Western Africa is the fact that most of the communities are exposed to climate change impacts, and they feel the effect of it very high because of no adaptation. So I think it is good for us to focus on adaptation measures, how communities can cope. For example, we established marine protected areas in coastal communities that we are doing quite well. We try to introduce territorial use rights in fisheries where the communities can actually have stewardship responsibilities to enforce the laws and to protect the resources that is important for their livelihoods. But from time to time, even though the stewardship responsibilities have been growing, communities are actually protecting the fish resources in their communities, but the effect of climate change often have severe impact on them, that there will be inundation of their houses, they will lose their fishing inputs, etc. So I have a perspective that we have to focus on climate adaptation, maybe to employ the soft engineering measures wherein we can think more of the ecosystems, protecting mangrove habitats, seagrass beds, coral reefs, etc., so that there will be adaptation at the community level to create resilience.
Great, thank you. All right. I'll give you more time to clap at the end, but I want to make sure these guys get their entire time. So the next one up, science communication.
So just to add to the need for climate adaptation, I believe that if we are going to combat these climate issues, we need to reinvigorate the dialogue, not just with fellow scientists and industry and technology. We need to talk to the general public. And we can do this by recreating the joy of ocean exploration, and not just to people who actually live by the ocean, but to those people who may not have the ocean in their backyard. Like, I'm lucky to be in Hawaii. The ocean is right there. So maybe some people don't understand the immediate impacts or other impacts that climate change may have to these persons. And so we should also get them interested in part of the conversation. And to add to that, when we introduce these issues, we shouldn't do it in a doom and gloom way. We need to do it in an uplifting way. And I think that's enough to incentivize them to care about what is potentially at stake, which is food security and home security. And also, I believe that through science communication, we can promote citizen science. We can inspire them to be environmental stewards, but also at the same time, we benefit by crowdsourcing data where it is appropriate and possible. So, thank you.
Great. Community.
I think we all agree that we're facing an era right now with a lot of environmental and complex environmental threats. And what I believe is that we really need a critical mass at this moment to help push forward solutions. And if we're going to do that, we need to engage people. And we need to engage people not just to teach them what we know or to learn from them, but to work together to scale solutions. So I just want to give a brief example with what we're doing in Planeta Oceano. We're engaging girls to report sea turtle nesting that then leads into management plans. We're working with local volunteers that are collecting data on plankton, on genetics, on anything you name it, people can help. So I think that's what I'm really passionate about creating this systems change in which we can all come together to a table and really work together to get to the solutions that we need.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, increase the impacts.
So I care about how and why, and I think we need constantly ask ourselves that question and have a good answer to that. And then I think that way we can increase the impact of all of our projects. So, and I think we do forget sometimes to stop and ask why and how we're going to do it and why we're doing it.
Great, thank you. What do you think of those answers? Anybody surprised? It's pretty good, right? So what I wanted to push this group of experts and young emerging scientists, I really wanted them to provide some reflections and recommendations of what they experienced over this week at Ocean Ops, both within their community of early scientists, but also their integration into the program itself. And so we're going to take a look at that. And so while we're thinking about that, I would encourage you to think about some questions for this group, because we'll get into some questions just after the recommendations and reflections that you want to hear more from, or that you want to have clarified from some of the responses that you've heard. Because this group is very, very eager to get their voices heard, as well as their colleagues in the early career sector that are out among the audience. So we'll start in the same kind of random pattern with their reflections and recommendations. So the first one, back to science, social science, Samuel.
So as a social scientist, I'm going to recommend you that to engage more social scientists in the future activities. I acknowledge that this ocean observing community has been working so hard to translate the ocean. After 3 ocean ops, I'm happy to see this community has clearly now realized that end users should be widely engaged in the next decade for a better ocean. That has been highlighted throughout this conference. Also, we also heard that there is a call to actively engage industry stakeholders for innovation. That's also mentioned by the other speakers. But my question is, how? How can we effectively engage the end users? How to effectively communicate with the policymakers? So in my own opinion, there is a gap between the science and policy to be closed. So my recommendation is the social scientists should be strategically and effectively engaged in the future ocean observing. We should realize that current effective engagement of social sciences or social scientists depends on overcoming the castings of social science in an end-of-pipe road in relation to the scientific and technological development. So speaking of actionable solutions to my recommendation, I would recommend to hire a highly qualified social scientist to get a project done, or to be partnered with social scientists at the very beginning of the stage, project planning or design stage. These should be done, in this way, we can leave the room for social scientists to do their own sciences. So for achieving this, I think the fundamental issue is to create an avenue, create avenues or opportunities like this Ocean Ops conference for both natural sciences and social scientists to figure out the common ground, the common interest. They can work together, they can co-design, co-create. I think that's the easiest entry point for them to work together.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Science communication, back on the list.
Hello. My main recommendation for the goals of achieving the recreation of joy in ocean exploration, as well as promoting and teaching about these issues in an uplifting way, as well as promoting citizen science, would be we need to piggyback on existing assets, resources, and infrastructure, which are cost-effective, open-source, user-friendly tools that the general public can use to either learn more about our oceans or to help us crowdsource those data. I also believe that we need to create space and foster mentorship between scientists and citizen scientists so that they can be guided and we can promote best practices so that we can make meaningful comparisons and discussions when data and uncertainty acquisition and analyses by these citizen scientists can be standardized. We also need to foster interdisciplinarity where end users like citizen scientists or us and tech developers and innovators can get together and answer these questions and make solutions together. An example would be like sharing our code, sharing our data so that we can learn from one another and we can get more work done. Thank you.
Thank you. Listen, sometimes I think that's a lesson for all of us, right? Or as my parents would say, but who put this one up?
I did. I say listen because I think we all need a space in the table. And what I'd like to talk about today is that we need to start putting people at the center of what we do. We're talking frequently about end users, and we sometimes forget that we are the end users as well. We're the people that's using the ecosystem services, we're the consumers, we're the tourists. So we owe ourselves to our society as well. And I think that's something that should be present in all the work and all the science that we do. I'm kind of surprised to not find enough social entrepreneurs at this meeting. I feel that we're talking about this gap in how science and society needs to connect more, and we need to spark that channel. And there's where other sectors could come in to partner with us and lead the message. We need to engage people, and I think that there's like this color palette of how you can engage people in the work that you do. You can do something like, for example, we do, that we're very strictly engaging the coastal communities. We're leading fishermen to pioneer manta ray conservation, manta ray ecotourism, policy, education. But you could do some really baby steps, just as simply go out of your lab for one day and visit the local fishermen and understand what they want and what they need. And from there, go to co-create. And what I mean co-create, it's not just about ideation, it's about co-implementation as well. If you want to go there, it's about co-monitoring as well together with the people. So I think that what we really need to do as a final recommendation is thoughtfully and strategically challenge our own status quo every day and see if we're engaging our people enough and if we're serving the final goal, because we're getting into this area where we can't afford to have science just simply because of mere curiosity as it was before. We need science to really change the world that we're going and make sure that our children have a decent future as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Bridge, that's an interesting one. Who contributed this?
Okay, so mine was connect or bridge, and for me, my vision is actually somewhat, may seem basic. It's just going back to personal connections. We talk a lot about a lot of these issues of engaging other communities and stakeholders. To me, it's really about individual connections between people. And so my hope is that we'll put effort into maintaining the connections that we developed here at this meeting and actively seek out new connections, because I think these are actually what are, in my opinion, at the core of this network. It's this community, the people that I'm looking at right now in the audience. This is our community, and it would be lovely to have each of us then continue to engage and interact and go out and bring new people into our community. And so my recommendation or ask of our community is to keep in touch with at least one new person that you met at this meeting, and possibly then further develop the reason why you connected. And I see this individual curiosity for new connections as being a very key step in moving our network, our observing networks, our passion for sustainability forward. Thank you.
Great. Connect. That's a nice lead-in, actually. It was on the list. All right. Who's going to take that one?
Yeah, we are already connecting as we're here. It is very important that we create networks that will enhance the observation of the oceans. Connecting is very important because it can enhance technology transfer and capacity building. I always emphasize on learning by doing. When we talk about capacity building, sometimes it could be that you are educated, you learn something, but you cannot do it. So connecting, for example, as we have come here, we've been exposed to opportunities to be able to implement when we get back the process of learning by doing. Connecting will also help to build capacities, will provide opportunities for education and seeking advanced knowledge. For example, in 2018, Connecting provided an opportunity for me to obtain a PhD scholarship to study at the University of Tasmania. I gave an oral presentation on the impact of climate change on marine protected areas at the Climate Change Symposium in Washington, D.C. So I was able to connect with people who are involved in similar activities, and that actually created an opportunity, and it will provide further opportunity to go and implement what I will learn and to implement further research in developing the knowledge of community people to actually be able to cope and adapt to climate change in marine protected areas.
Great, thank you. Integration and measurement. I'm kind of surprised when I saw this one. So what does this one mean? Are we?
Michael?
Can we go back?
I think we were saying that we're good at technology, but not so good yet. Like, do you want to tell?
Yeah. My recommendation would be indigenize. And I think we've made a lot of good steps at this Ocean Obs 19. This is the first Ocean Obs that has had an Indigenous delegation, and I am very incredibly thankful to be a part of the Canadian Indigenous delegation, and thank you to our Hawaiian Indigenous hosts for having all of us here on your territory. Thank you very much. This has been a first step with the Ocean Obs community, and I see that we have made a lot of good progress on bringing Indigenous representation to the table, with how many times we've seen the indigenous knowledge integration being an important aspect of your work, and also the desire to have indigenous communities be throughout your entire project process. But like I said earlier, there's something different between integration and making space for indigenous worldviews themselves. And so with my recommendation comes the desire for this community to support indigenous ocean observing networks and expanding on those. There's many good examples of pre-existing indigenous ocean observing networks like the Guardian Watchmen, which we have back home, which are indigenous stewards and the environmental enforcement arm of our communities that go and collect abiotic and biotic data on their own territory that directly feeds into management recommendations with local governments, other local governments. But I also think it happens in a lot more of an informal way when I speak to my uncles and aunts and they tell me that they've got to go that much further to go catch fish or to go harvest kelp for the spawning kelp fisheries. And so that type of network, I think, in an indigenous way, with an indigenous perspective, needs to be fostered at this level and given its own space in the ocean observing community.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I will say, take it as a lesson, young career. Don't do your slides the night before because you do tend to forget something. So I'll take the responsibility for not having that on the slide. So I apologize, but thank you for making sure this was reflected. And the last one, integration and measurement.
So on this panel, we've talked about community engagement, indigenous knowledge, increased public participation through citizen science and communication. But throughout the week, there's more things came up, and we haven't touched on this panel on data and observations. So in the next decade, we need to look at all the components as a whole, and we need to develop performance measures and metrics to evaluate the success. We need to use available data and adapt fast as more data becomes available and as new technology gets developed. We need to define measurable goals and objectives because we have competing interests and goals, and we need to prioritize projects and funding for them by constantly asking back to my why and how. And that's how I see the ocean plan as a living document by constantly revisiting what our objectives. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So when I think about these, I see some obvious connections, at least in my interpretation, that the young career may not be as involved as we should have them involved in this process, both in the transition going into the next ocean ops, but also the planning. And I think what you're hearing from here and from talking to this group of phenomenal people is that they want to be at the table. They want to be more integrated into the process because they all bring different perspectives and different values. So I would actually encourage the program committee and the future program committee to bring a young career person with you and to provide the opportunity for the young careers and encourage those young careers to really contribute to the Living Action Plan. It would be really, I think, a unique opportunity for every outcome that's going to come from the Living Action Plan, that there's a young scientist contribution to that, so that we can integrate different perspectives. So you're not only seeing the same perspective. But I was really taken aback because the words that are coming out on these recommendations, to me, show an opportunity that we can maybe improve the way that we're integrating this community into the process. So I don't know if people have their own reflections from what you've heard, but I'd encourage you to put that on Slido. We have a couple minutes, actually a few minutes according to my clock, because this group has done so well keeping on time. Good job, guys. That we're gonna allow you to ask them some questions. So can we put up the Slido, please? Perfect. All right, so if you have a question for our panelists, I'll have one while we get the audience going. So what is something that you would recommend in terms of integrating and transitioning young careers into the ocean ops process, especially looking at 29 and 39. Anybody?
I'll take that. I think, so to me, integrating new perspectives into processes requires, as I said first, building personal connections. I think in a lot of ways it's on us to build connections with people that can bring us into the process, but also I think a key piece of that is institutionalizing those positions and opportunities. And I think that is sort of the next step is actually building in, as you mentioned, building in official task teams, positions, whatever it may be, into the process that officially then can contribute to moving it forward.
Great, thanks, Erin. Any in the audience, you can also come up to the mic. So I like this question. How do we escape the dilution of words like sustainability, integration, climate change? And I'm going to add my own verb into that, but how do we actualize, right? So we can say these words over and over. So what are some of the ways that we can actually bring back the action to these words so that they have an impact to the communities and to the groups that you're working with?
I'd say, responding to that, showcase and scale case studies. We have a lot of things going on around the world. I also felt sometimes a bit strange when people say, how do we do this? How do we engage communities? There are thousands of examples out there of step-by-step processes and how this has been done already. And I think that what we need to do as a community is identify those successful case studies and scale them as examples. So we need to start thinking about the how and not just about those overarching terms.
Anyone else want to add to that, please?
We did try to avoid the jargon, if you could, you probably have noticed in their recommendations, because it's also, we did notice that the same words come up, but then not much changes and it just becomes, another buzzword. So I don't know the answer, but we've tried to avoid it.
Shaku, I think you wanted to add?
I just want to weigh in on the climate change aspect. I wouldn't say we will be able to avoid the jargon of climate change because the climate is changing in any case. But what I would say is perhaps we may want to see how to adapt to climate change. We know the climate is changing, so maybe we adopt the jargon of adapting to climate change by, say, for example, mainstreaming National Adaptation Program of Action as emphasized by the International Panel or Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, that countries must be able to adapt because the climate is changing anyway. So adapting is one way where you'll be able to cope with the effects of the climate change. So we may want to replace the jargon of climate change to adapting to climate change by implementing what I call soft engineering measures, for example, adopting national programs of actions, mainstreaming climate adaptation in all of the programs, in agriculture, in mining sectors, in health sectors, and all other sectors. You mainstream the adaptation of climate change. In other countries, for example, the drainages are very poor, so you experience a lot of flooding. So what you can do is to enhance drainage facilities. Don't wait until the flooding occurs. Make sure you do what can prevent the flooding of having impact. In other countries, like we saw a few weeks ago in the Bahamas, the Hurricane Dorian, that was devastating effect. What can we do for human beings to adapt to these effects of these hurricanes? Can we make bunkers where human beings can actually be on the ground when, the water comes and then they can come up later on, etc. There are several issues we can do to be able to adapt to climate change. In countries like I come from, in Sierra Leone, the main issue there is drainage. Every year we see a lot of devastating effect of flooding, and people say, we have this rain, a lot of rain is coming. I always tell them, look, let us start from the drawing board. Can we enhance our drainage systems? let us make sure that we do the things that can make us to be able to cope with the climate change effect. What are the early warning systems we have in place? Let us don't wait until the climate strikes. If we wait for the disasters to strike before we solve the problem, it becomes very difficult. So what we can do, have early warning systems, improve the capacity in other countries to know that, hey, there's going to be heavy downpour of rainfall so that human beings cannot die, and things like that. So let us replace the jargon of climate change to climate change adaptation.
So it can be just a transition and not just in that repetitive nature. And I think we can bring a science integrity to this as well, which I've seen many of you present this week. Okay, so we are at the end of time. I know I could go all morning with this group of people, so I wanted them to close on a lightning round. So lightning round, no more than 5 or 6 words. Where do you see yourself by Oceans 29? Ocean Ops 29. And we'll just go down the row, except I'm going to leave Samuel for the last.
I would see myself scaling the impact that I have globally, hopefully growing, and hopefully partnering with some of the people in the room to scale this approach.
Quickly supporting future generations.
Develop capacities, particularly in developing countries and small island developing states, to be able to cope with the effects of climate change, to adopt simple signs. For example, fishermen should know when to go fishing. They know the tidal differences, the tidal ranges at their community level. They don't need to wait for scientists. Build the capacities, increase climate adaptation funding for developing countries that are emitting less greenhouse gas but suffering the most from the effect of climate change.
I'll be quick. I see myself surrounded by the positive change.
I see myself surrounded by this community in its old and new form.
I see myself with my PhD and a postdoc, but also, hopefully,
you'll get there.
Yeah, but hopefully add the humanity to my research, not forgetting the stakeholders, and again, like reiterating what Kirsten said, including them into the table and the conversation. And I'm happy to learn more from you how to better do that. So thank you.
I see myself to be there again as a social scientist, and also hopefully could be one of the organizing committee to representing early career scientists or professionals to realize what we have recommended today, and also to engage more early career professionals in next ocean ops in China. How does that sound?
That sounds great, because isn't the next Ocean Ops in China? All right, so I think I see a new program committee member right here. Let's give these men and women our loudest round of applause. I think this is a great group, and you're going to see amazing things from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and all the panelists for the fascinating talks. So we will have a break from here, and we will back. The next session will start at 10:45 sharp. So please grab your coffee just quickly, and be back this room on time. Thank you very much.
We might.
No extra.